Well, good afternoon, and I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. As I see it, this session is sort of the sorbet between two heavy courses at a dinner, so hopefully it'll work out that way. I've been at Science Magazine for 30 years, and I'm going to talk to you about the challenges facing Science with a capital S, the magazine that I love, and also Science with a lowercase s, thinking about what is happening in different fields and some of the more recent challenges that people are having to face in different fields. So, Science Magazine was started in the 1800s at a time when the information for contributors said that you had to please write legibly and only on one side of the page. And if you wanted to find out how an experiment was done, well, the whole scientific community could march to a lab and watch it being done. It was very different. Our mission to publish the best in science in all areas hasn't changed, but a lot of things have changed. Now we're not just one print magazine. We are a family of journals: Science Translational Medicine, Science Signaling. In February, the newest member of that family, Science Advances, began. It is an open access journal, also publishing in all areas of science, but focusing on applications, engineering, mathematics, variety of things, and they welcome new submissions. We also are much more than a print journal. Daily news features, careers features, mobile apps, video portals, all of the facets of being online. Certainly we track progress by impact factors, even though they are a very imperfect method, but we track progress in other ways too. If you go on, look at any paper that we've published, we present all metrics data on news attention, on tweets, on Facebook. Our own Facebook site in the last quarter had more than 1.5 million followers. Over the past 20 years, the number of papers that we get has risen steadily. We are now getting something like 200 to 300 submissions a week, which is a massive amount. And in order to deal with this flood, we have a system of triage, at first involving 200 luminaries who aren't doing in-depth review, but are looking at a paper and saying, if it was correct, is this exciting enough, is this interesting enough for science to publish? After that, papers are sent out to peer review. And if anyone wants to know more about our peer review process or how to publish papers in science, I would be happy to take you through all of the gory details after this session. We consider the peer review process as the foundation for our reputation. It is necessary for people to know that they're going to a place where the standards are high and the research is of good quality. But the task for reviewers and for authors has become much harder with time. One of those examples is in authorship. It used to be that single author papers were the paradigm. Now more and more we're seeing teams of authors and interdisciplinary groups. I would say the largest number of authors I've seen on a science paper is something like 250. But if you look at this publication from Thomson Reuters, you can see that there are papers with more than 1,000 authors, more than 500 authors. Communication becomes very difficult. Parts of the project are scattered. And it's a way that problems can easily arise. Certainly, projects are becoming more interdisciplinary. No one author can know everything. Authors come with very different concepts and ideas about how science should be done. This can especially be a problem in human subject research, where there are even different definitions for what informed consent can be. So how do journals deal with this? One thing that we have done is to set up forms. The senior author for each lab has to sign off saying that the data that was generated by the lab or by the group was examined by that senior author. Every author on a paper has to state what their level of participation was. Where did they participate? Were they responsible for one section, one table, an analytical method? Were they just drafting or revising the paper? And we've found that just the act of taking responsibility for a particular part can make people a little bit more thoughtful about what has gone into a paper. But this communication problem that I mentioned can occur even at the very beginning. When papers are submitted, the first thing that happens at the magazine is a message is automatically sent out to each author saying, did you approve publication? Did you approve submission of this manuscript? And I would say once a month, we get a response back saying, I didn't know the paper was going to be submitted. I did not approve this version of the paper, and happily on rarer occasions, my lawyers will be in touch with you. I do not want my name associated with this paper in any form. And this is a facet of having so many groups trying to communicate. One thing that we are certainly seeing is that there is too much data, too much discussion to go into the print version of a manuscript. So what we have is supplemental online material. And many people do indeed feel that it is out of control. Certainly there are many cases where the supplemental material is larger than the paper itself. 20 years ago, it was very rare to find a paper with supplemental material. Now it's incredibly rare to find a paper without it. And the question is then, how do reviewers deal with this? How is a paper reviewed properly? Different journals have taken different approaches to this. One rather draconian approach was taken by the Journal of Neuroscience, who decided in 2010 that they weren't going to let authors include supplemental material. They said supplemental material has begun to undermine the peer review process, and that in fact, most reviewers don't look at the supplemental material, even if they say they did. Sometimes methods could be buried, or important points can be buried in the pages and pages of supplemental material, and can be overlooked until much later. They also said they felt that the idea of demanding that reviewers with limited time thoroughly look at the supplemental material was just unrealistic and impractical. We haven't gone that far. What we've just done is stipulate that the supplemental material should only be 25 megabytes per upload. We've said that authors have to use a very strict template that limits them to the most essential information that is needed to understand the paper. We have said that the data has to be related to the main text. We index the references so that they're very easy to find. It would be extremely easy for us to use unpublished data and to rely on just saying data not shown or unpublished. But we have made the decision that we are not going to allow unpublished data or data not shown. It is true in many fields, but especially recently in the climate change field, that when there are bitter battles over data, readers can become very hostile if they can't look at every piece of data that's being used to bolster an argument. We insist on data being deposited in an archive or database, or included in the supplemental material, or in rare cases, archived at the author's site, but then we need guarantees that it will be maintained there, and I'll come back to that later. Another thing in terms of the many different fields that can be dealt with in one paper is that we have cross reviews. We let the reviewers see each other's reviews so that there can be a discussion sometimes when one community says paper's fantastic and the other community says, it's not such a great advance. One of the reasons that the amount of data in a paper has gone up so dramatically, and the supplemental material, is that concerns have been growing in a lot of venues about reproducibility. And this has made its way into the popular press. Here is a New York Times piece from 2012 in which Carl Zimmer was talking about the rise in retractions and the calls for reform. Here is another piece that came out in 2013 in The Economist. And I recently heard an NIH representative say that when the economists get involved in science, then you know that there are problems. This has been especially a concern, of course, in clinical and preclinical studies. Now, reproducibility is described in a lot of different ways. It can be called reproducibility, repeatability, replicability, robustness, generalizability. All of it deals with what Colbert would have called the truthiness of the data. One way of thinking about it is as a part of a spectrum of reproducibility. At the low end, this minimum standard is taking the data that was in a paper, taking the code that was in the paper, and seeing if you can actually reproduce the results in that particular paper using their own materials. At the high end is what is sometimes called replication, where someone starts fresh. New data collection, fresh materials, reagents, can they repeat that result? So why is it that things aren't reproducible? Well, sometimes information is withheld. In the past, certainly, journals have not always given enough space to methods. Sometimes the author doesn't think it's important to go into. Sometimes the author is deliberately being a little bit cagey in the hopes of keeping their own territory free of other people moving in. There can be proprietary or privacy concerns. Sometimes it's a matter of communicating tacit knowledge that the practitioner doesn't even know about, that someone has been doing a certain experiment in a certain way for so long, they just take it for granted. Sometimes a system really isn't known well enough, and there are problems in the experimental design. Not all of the variables are controlled. There can be problems in the statistics, in dealing with false positives and thinking about false positives. To look at some examples of that, this is taken from a paper published in 2015 by Begley and Ioannidis, and it exemplifies a lot of the things that I've just mentioned. For example, looking at a set of studies on stroke in animal models, there was publication bias alleged. Only 2% of the studies were negative. So this is what has sometimes been called the file draw problem, that you can publish positive results, but the negative results just get kind of put away. In a set of next generation sequencing studies, 26 out of 50 did not give sufficient access to primary data sets or software so that someone could reproduce the work. In studies of physical activity, the wrong experimental measures were used in 31 out of 34 studies examined. In microarray studies, the Whitwer piece in 2013, they alleged that 93 out of 127 articles that they looked at were not Miami compliant. Another problem is antibodies. A study in 2013 alleged that an ELISA kit had identified the wrong antigen. And in making that transition from translational studies to actual clinical studies, industry representatives have said there's a lot of problems with antibody use in academia and the way the antibodies are handled that augments this problem of irreproducibility. So again, what can journals do about this? And different journals, of course, have taken different strategies. Quarterly Journal of Political Science has said that if you submitted an empirical paper, you have to supply a replication data set for the editors and for the referees. And once the manuscript is accepted, you've got to have that replication set archived, and it will be made available at the site when it's published. Another recent development is that companies have started getting into replication. Science Exchange is an organization that has 75 university laboratories and a host of other collaborators working on replicating findings. The Center for Open Science is developing software to facilitate data sharing. These two organizations have gotten together with a $1.3 million grant from the Laura and John Arnold Foundation to replicate findings for 50 preclinical cancer biology studies. That work is in progress. It has begun to be published. In 2014, there was a meeting of about 30 journals to talk about problems, to talk about common experiences, to think through what could be done to help promote reproducibility. My editor-in-chief, Marsha McNutt, wrote an editorial talking about this and talking about the consensus that they reached that appears in an NIH principles and guidelines for reporting preclinical research. It includes some things that may sound to you like mom and apple pie. I mean, how could anyone not know this? Rigorous statistical analysis, transparency in reporting, core standards for reporting study design, the data and materials sharing. All journals should consider refutations of things that they've published, which we do in our technical comments. And NIH is considering establishing best practice guidelines for image-based data and for description of the biological materials used. These guidelines go into a lot more depth and detail about what it is they mean by each of these things. That's something that has spread through all of the science journals. Here is something from Science Translational Medicine that has put together a list of guidelines for doing various kinds of studies that are related to translational science. That includes animal studies, diagnostic markers, looking at genetic associations, biospecimens, all of which are expected to be followed. We also, in thinking about the statistical and experimental design problems, decided at Science Magazine that it was time to set up a statistical board of reviewing editors who have been a great help to us. And you can see names on there like Giovanni Parmigiana from Dana-Farber, who looks at the statistics of cancer, human genetics, Alison Motzinger-Reef, who looks at genomics, proteomics, metabolomics, Ron Brookmeyer, who's been very much involved in public health, in looking at infectious disease epidemiology and public policy, Ian Wilson in structural biology, Chris Weichel and Richard Smith, looking more at climate change, ecology studies, environment. And so we send to them papers that we feel need that additional expertise, in addition to the peer review process. We have had for quite some time now data and materials policies, that all of the data necessary to understand, assess, and extend the conclusions of the manuscript must be available to any reader of science. All the computer codes involved should be available to any reader of science. If there are any restrictions, they have to be discussed with the editor upon submission before a paper can be accepted, so we can decide whether the exceptions are necessary. And I'll come back to that also, because there are fields where that is still a matter very much under debate. Again, in terms of data availability, we are relying on an ever-increasing number of databases for different kinds of data, and we list those on our site. The Dryad database for ecological data, well, Dryad is now going beyond ecological data, and we are working with them to see if we can use them even more extensively as an established repository for data. We're also working with Figshare to see about new ways that data can be shared, and the data underlying each figure in a paper can be readily seen. So all of this sounds very good. You know, you say, okay, we've solved the problem. That's it. And it's not quite that simple. One thing that complicates life is, what if you can't easily or realistically reproduce or replicate something? Certainly, field studies can be very expensive and at times impossible to replicate the exact conditions. Here, being able to upload videos has been very important, but we are planning a workshop to talk to various field study researchers and to see what it is that we can do to improve how that data is presented. What if there's only one sun, or you've done a Sloan Sky survey and there's only one data set like that? What is it that you can do? How do you have models that can be tested? And these are all questions that we are beginning to confront now. There are differences between scientific cultures. Now, in February, there was a meeting at the National Academies on statistical challenges associated with data reproducibility. They have just posted all the videos of that meeting, and I would suggest anyone who is more interested in these questions ought to watch the videos, because there were some very good sessions there. Some of the things that Steve Goodman at Stanford brought up was that different fields have different signal to measurement error ratios, that what's accepted as significant in one field will not be accepted in another. Different statistical methods, different standards for claims, complexity of design and measurement tools. Let's say you're testing a hypothesis with one procedure. If you test that same hypothesis with a different procedure, will you get the same answers? It's not always true. The closeness of fit between the hypothesis and the experimental design and data, and that again has to do with the design and sometimes the rigor of that experiment. Different communities have different standards for transparency and for replication, with the genomics community perhaps being on one side of the spectrum, the social scientists and economists, I could argue, are on the other side of that spectrum. There are also questions about the purposes to which a finding will be put. What are the consequences of false claims? And then, of course, the clinical studies with human implications are at the high end of that. Two problems that I haven't talked about. One of them, of course, many here are more familiar with than I am, and that is genomic data and dealing with human genomic data and privacy concerns. The impossibility or difficulty in some cases of truly anonymizing data, the concerns in the public about the security of that data. That's not something that's unique to the genome community, and the discussions about that are not unique to the genome community. In the social sciences, there are many, especially in the computational social sciences, who feel that the most exciting advances are going to be made with data sets that are proprietary. Mobile phone data sets, social media data sets that researchers receive because they've made agreements with particular companies. What do you do in that case? Well, some journals, like the American Journal of Political Science, has said, you cannot publish. If you're using any kind of proprietary data like that, don't bother submitting. Other journals within that same community are looking for other possibilities of being careful to state how authors can make arrangements to get access to data, of presenting pooled tables of data to make reproducibility possible, although not providing all of the individual data. It is still very much an ongoing discussion, and there isn't consensus in the field. So I've talked to you a lot about what journals can do, and there certainly is a lot. However, there's also a lot that has to be done at the level of individual researchers in terms of discussing this culture of reproducibility, in terms of thinking it through and doing more than having good words about it, but actually acting in such a way as to promote open data sharing. Institutions need to promote training. Too much is taken for granted about good experimental design without it being actually taught, about responsible conduct of science, and all of that has to have its place within the educational system. Funders and institutions need to find ways to reward good conduct. If reproducibility is a public good, how do we make that happen? Well, you have to reward good behavior. You have to provide incentives for replication to happen. There have to be places for negative results to be published. You have to reward people who are especially good at data sharing. All of these things are necessary and will have to be built into the system. All of this, of course, sounds challenging and maybe a little bit depressing, but it can be viewed positively too. This is from a Washington Post blog. And Joel Achenbach said, "There's a movement afoot and building momentum rapidly. Roughly 4 centuries after the invention of the scientific method, the leaders of the scientific community are recalibrating their requirements and pushing for the sharing of data and greater experimental transparency." So it's an exciting time. And like everything else, the process of doing science and the process of publishing science have to evolve. And on that note, I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you so much.
Questions? I was happy my name wasn't in some of those lists, I have to say. Okay, well, I think that was very informational, and I think it was, thank you.
So I actually have 2 questions. So one of them is, assuming all of this doesn't work and a bad study gets through, what do you do to flag it so that a scientist or a journalist doing like a Google Scholar search or something like that doesn't come across the article and be unaware of sort of the subsequent developments? And then the second question is how you deal with errors that come into being at like the lab bench level where peer reviewers may not even see the lab notebooks or that level of data. They just get the data summary, so any problems there are sort of hidden.
When there are severe problems with a paper, certainly the most serious of those problems, there are retractions of the paper or editorial expressions of concern, and those are linked to the paper and we publish them. That, however, there is a long process when someone writes to us that there is a problem with a paper, we investigate it and see whether we feel that there is, in fact, reason for concern. We publish technical comments on papers when scientists may disagree about the interpretation or about how experiments were performed, and we will publish both sides of those debates. In terms of errors, okay. Again, the most serious kind, when there are questions of image manipulation, for example, we have procedures in place to try and detect them beforehand. However, lots of things can happen at the bench. It will depend on people trying to repeat those experiments, telling us that they can't repeat them. We have had authors themselves come forward and say, you know, we thought everything was good, but something clearly was wrong with that reagent because we have a new batch of it and we cannot repeat it, and we publish those. And that's the best that we can do. I do still believe that science is a self-correcting process, and as people try and build on past science, that's how errors are revealed.
Dan.
So from the perspective From the perspective of science, but you can extend it to other journals as well, how much longer do you think journals are going to be printed on paper?
That's a great question. 10 years ago, people were saying print journals aren't going to last another 5 years. They're still around. I think we are seeing, in all honesty, a divide where older readers are tending to read in print and younger readers are tending to read online. What will happen as those young readers age, I can't tell you. It is certainly something we are aware of, and it's why, of course, we are expanding online. I think there will still be a need for journals. I think there will be a need for the kinds of services of quality control that we provide, and more than that, of the breadth of topics that we cover. So I think Science Magazine itself is safe. What we are trying to do is to entice the online readers to look at different parts of the magazine. It's much easier when you have a print copy in your hand and you flip through. And maybe you're a genome scientist, but you get captured by this nebula. That's such an incredible picture. And so you stop for a while, just to read the abstract and the conclusions and just to see what's going on. I'm not giving up on print yet, but then I'm a person who loves old bookstores and things like that. The journal itself will continue. If it's not in print and it's online, that will be fine too.
Okay, last question.
Along the same lines, what about archival storage? Because paper's been a marvelous medium for archiving everything, but there are now concerns in many other media where there's a loss of content, images and other sorts of materials. Mm-hmm. What do you think is the plan long-term for scientific literature?
We have been putting the literature online as well. I mean, we have what's called classic science, and I forget if it actually goes back to 1880, but we do have, we are archiving our material online as well. Best I can tell you. Again, thank you.
Okay, thanks again, Barbara. That was great.